Raven's Hollow was a place of perpetual twilight. Even in the noon hours, the sun barely crested the hills, casting long, creeping shadows over the cobblestone streets. The town's grand estates, once symbols of wealth and prosperity, now stood decayed and shrouded in ivy, their occupants mere whispers in the dark. It was here, in the fading heart of this forgotten place, that Dorian Black resided. Dorian's home, an imposing manor at the edge of town, stood as a testament to his family's long-forgotten glory. Its towering spires reached into the ever-clouded sky, as though trying to escape the gloom that enveloped the town below. Few people ever visited Raven's Hollow, and even fewer dared approach the Black Estate. Yet on this particular day, a visitor arrived, an artist, summoned for reasons unknown to the townsfolk. The artist, Nathaniel Gray, had heard rumors of Dorian Black before. Whispers spoke of a man of impossible beauty, preserved by some unseen force, as though the passage of time had chosen to overlook him. Nathaniel had dismissed such tales as mere gossip, but the generous commission offered by Dorian was enough to quiet his skepticism. As Nathaniel's carriage rattled through the mist-shrouded gates of Black Manor, a sense of foreboding washed over him. He had painted portraits for the wealthiest of patrons, but there was something unsettling about this particular assignment. His fingers tightened around the leather strap of his satchel, where his brushes and oils lay nestled. The weight of the task seemed heavier than usual. The carriage came to a stop, and the door swung open with a creak. Nathaniel stepped onto the gravel path, his boots sinking into the soft earth as a gust of cold wind swept through the trees. The manor loomed ahead, its dark windows like hollow eyes watching his approach. With every step closer, the sensation of being drawn into something unknowable intensified. The butler, a frail and silent man with hollow cheeks and downcast eyes, met him at the door and led him through the dimly lit corridors of the estate. The walls were lined with portraits of long-dead ancestors, their eyes following Nathaniel with an eerie attentiveness. He couldn't shake the feeling that they disapproved of his presence, as though the very house itself held its breath, waiting. Finally, they reached a grand salon at the center of the manor. The room was vast, its ceilings vaulted and adorned with fading murals. Candles flickered in the sconces, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. At the far end of the room, standing before a tall, unlit fireplace, was Dorian Black. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. Dorian was, as the rumors had described, perhaps more so. His beauty was almost otherworldly. Dark hair, perfectly combed, framed a face that could have been carved from marble, his skin smooth and untouched by age. His eyes, however, were something else entirely. Cold, calculating, with a glint of something dark lurking just beneath the surface. Mr. Gray. Dorian's voice was low, a purr of amusement, as though he could read the artist's unease. I trust your journey was not too unpleasant. Nathaniel managed a nod, his mouth dry. The fog was thick, but nothing unusual for this region. Dorian smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Good. I've been waiting for someone like you, an artist with a true gift. You understand beauty, yes? The kind that transcends mere flesh. Nathaniel swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. I strive to capture what I see, Mr. Black. Dorian stepped closer, his presence almost suffocating. That is why you are here. You will paint me as I am, not just in appearance, but in essence. Before Nathaniel could ask what he meant, Dorian gestured to a large canvas set up in the center of the room. It was blank, waiting, almost eager, for the first stroke of the brush. I want you to make me eternal, Dorian said softly. To preserve me as I am now. Forever. Nathaniel felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. Something in Dorian's gaze chilled him to his core, but the commission had already been accepted. There was no turning back now. With trembling hands, he unpacked his tools and prepared to begin the portrait that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The air in the grand salon felt heavy, laden with the smell of oil paints and something else. Something darker, more elusive. Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though Dorian stood still as a statue, poised beside the tall windows that overlooked the fog-shrouded garden. His gaze never left the artist, his expression unreadable, as though he were studying not just Nathaniel's technique, but the very fabric of his soul. The first brushstroke felt like an act of defiance against the overwhelming quiet. The soft bristles glided across the canvas, leaving behind a streak of rich ochre. Nathaniel exhaled, trying to steady his nerves. This was no different from any other portrait he had painted, or so he told himself. Yet the room itself seemed to hum with a strange energy, as if the blank canvas was far more than mere cloth and wood. Dorian remained unnervingly still, his eyes gleaming beneath the flickering candlelight. Nathaniel worked in silence, his focus narrowing to the task before him. As the hours passed, he became absorbed in the details, the sharp angle of Dorian's jaw, the faint shadow beneath his cheekbone, the curve of his lips that hinted at a smirk. His brushes moved with more precision than ever, yet his unease only deepened. It was nearing midnight when the first flicker of doubt crept into Nathaniel's mind. He had been lost in his work for hours, but something was wrong. He stepped back to assess his progress, expecting the usual satisfaction that came with seeing a likeness take shape. Instead, a knot of dread twisted in his chest. The face staring back at him from the canvas was perfect. Too perfect. It wasn't merely a representation of Dorian's features. It was as though he had painted life itself. The eyes glinted with an unnatural sharpness, the skin practically glowing with vitality. The portrait seemed to pulse, as if it were a living thing. Nathaniel blinked, stepping closer to inspect the details. His heart pounded in his chest. The hair he had just finished painting shimmered with an odd luster, catching the dim light in a way that paint shouldn't. And the eyes, those cold, piercing eyes, seemed to follow him, reflecting a depth and malice that hadn't been there before. "Remarkable," Dorian said, his voice startlingly close. Nathaniel flinched, realizing Dorian had silently moved to stand beside him. He hadn't heard a single footstep. Dorian's gaze flickered between the canvas and the artist, his lips curling into a satisfied smile. "I must say, Mr. Gray, you have exceeded my expectations." Nathaniel's throat was dry. He swallowed, struggling to speak. It's not finished. There are still adjustments to be made." Dorian raised an eyebrow, amused. "It looks quite finished to me." Nathaniel turned back to the portrait, staring at the eerie perfection before him. His mind raced to make sense of what he was seeing. It wasn't possible. He had painted dozens of portraits in his career, but none had ever turned out like this. The vibrancy, the sharpness, felt as though something beyond him had guided his hand. "Mr. Black," Nathaniel began hesitantly, "there's something about this painting that feels off." Dorian's smile widened. "Oh, what might that be?" Nathaniel hesitated, unsure of how to explain the growing dread gnawing at his insides. He gestured weakly at the canvas. "It's too lifelike, too real, almost as if it possesses a soul?" Dorian interrupted, his tone light but his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. Nathaniel recoiled slightly. I don't know what you mean. Dorian stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Don't you? You've captured me perfectly, Mr. Gray. Every line, every detail. You've made me eternal. Nathaniel's pulse quickened. The room seemed to darken around them, the candles flickering wildly as a chill swept through the air. The once familiar scent of oil paints was now mingled with something sharp, metallic, like the scent of decay. What are you saying? Nathaniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dorian's expression remained calm, but there was a dangerous gleam in his eyes. You've done what many before you have failed to do. You've immortalized me, not in mere paint, but in essence. This portrait, Mr. Gray, will bear the weight of time while I remain untouched by its cruel hand. Nathaniel stepped back, his blood running cold. That's impossible. Impossible. Dorian's voice was soft, menacing. No, my dear artist. It is merely the price for perfection. Nathaniel's hand shook as he turned back to the portrait. The face on the canvas was no longer just a reflection of Dorian. It was something far more sinister. The eyes seemed to glisten with a malevolent light, as though they were aware of the curse they now carried. And beneath that flawless exterior, Nathaniel sensed a darkness waiting to be unleashed. His chest tightened as a single horrifying realization settled over him. He had not just painted Dorian black. He had captured his soul. Months passed since Nathaniel completed the portrait, but the unease lingered like a fog. The finished painting hung in Dorian Black's private gallery, hidden from public view. Yet, despite the distance Nathaniel had tried to put between himself and the manor, he could not forget it. The whispers of Raven's Hollow grew louder, as did his own sense of foreboding. It was said that Dorian had not aged a day since the portrait was unveiled. Not a single line marred his perfect face, and his dark hair remained as lustrous as ever. The town's aging aristocrats remarked enviously, some suggesting secret elixirs or exotic treatments, but none could explain the unnerving truth behind Dorian's untouched beauty. Nathaniel found himself sleepless many nights, the memory of those cold, piercing eyes from the canvas haunting him. He had not spoken to Dorian since that fateful evening, nor had he returned to the manor, but rumors of strange occurrences began to surface. The most unsettling came from those who had visited Dorian recently. One evening, Nathaniel overheard two gentlemen in a crowded tavern speaking in hushed tones about the misfortunes that seemed to follow those closest to Dorian. Lord Hallbridge, a longtime friend of Dorian's, had died under mysterious circumstances, his face twisted in terror, found locked inside his study. Lady Gwendolen, who had once pursued Dorian's affections, was said to have gone mad, raving about eyes that saw everything before throwing herself into the river. Despite these tragedies, Dorian thrived. The more death and ruin swirled around him, the more alive he seemed to become. And with each passing day, the portrait remained untouched by time, its subject forever youthful, forever beautiful. Nathaniel, desperate to make sense of the madness, resolved to confront the truth himself. It was on a cold, moonless night that he returned to Raven's Hollow, the biting wind pushing him forward like an unseen hand. His boots echoed on the cobblestones as he made his way to Black Manor, the looming shadow of the house rising above him like a great beast. The door opened before he could knock, as if the manor had been expecting him. The same frail butler, silent as ever, led him wordlessly down the familiar corridors. The house felt colder, darker than before, and the once faded portraits lining the walls seemed to watch him more intently. Dorian awaited him in the grand salon, standing by the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. He looked just as he had the night Nathaniel first painted him. Perfect, youthful, and unnervingly serene. "Nathaniel," Dorian greeted, his voice smooth and inviting. "It's been too long." Nathaniel's stomach churned at the sight of him. "It has," he managed, though his voice was tight. Dorian gestured toward a nearby armchair. "Please sit. You look pale. I fear you've been worrying yourself too much." Nathaniel did not sit. Instead, his eyes flicked to the door at the far end of the room, the door that led to the gallery where the cursed portrait hung. Dorian noticed. "Ah," he said softly. "You came to see the painting, didn't you? It haunts you still." "I need to understand," Nathaniel said, his voice wavering. "I need to know what happened that night. What have I done?" Dorian's expression remained calm, but there was something predatory in his gaze. He moved closer, his presence overwhelming. "You've done something extraordinary, Nathaniel. You've granted me freedom. Freedom from the ravages of time, from death itself. Isn't that the dream of every man?" Nathaniel recoiled, his skin prickling with fear. "And what of the others? Those who have died, gone mad?" Dorian's lips curved into a smile, cold and sharp. "The world is cruel, my dear artist. Some are meant to suffer, but not me." Unable to bear it any longer, Nathaniel rushed toward the gallery door, throwing it open. The moment he stepped inside, the air seemed to freeze. The walls were lined with paintings of the Black family, all of them old, worn by time, except for one. The portrait of Dorian Black dominated the room, its pristine canvas untouched by dust or decay. Nathaniel stared at the figure before him, heart pounding in his chest. At first glance, it looked the same. Dorian, impossibly beautiful, his eyes gleaming with life. But as Nathaniel drew closer, he noticed the faintest shift in the expression. The face in the portrait no longer looked serene. Beneath the flawless features lurked something dark, twisted. The eyes, those eyes, they no longer shimmered with life but burned with something far more sinister. Greed, cruelty, and a hunger that chilled Nathaniel to his bones. Dorian's voice echoed behind him. "The portrait bears the weight of time, Nathaniel. As I remain eternal, it suffers for me." Nathaniel's breath hitched as he stepped closer, watching in horror as the corners of Dorian's mouth in the painting began to curl into a malicious grin. His youthful face remained, but the eyes, now filled with malice, glinted with the price of immortality. Nathaniel staggered back, his mind reeling. He had condemned Dorian's soul to this canvas, and in doing so, he had unleashed something far worse. "You see, Nathaniel," Dorian whispered, his voice like a shadow, "I shall never age. But the portrait, oh, it will carry the burden of every sin." The days after Nathaniel's discovery passed in a haze of dread. The knowledge of what he had done gnawed at him like a festering wound. He could not shake the image of the portrait, the twisted grin, the eyes that seemed to contain all the malice Dorian Black had ever hidden behind his perfect face. The guilt weighed heavily on his soul, yet he found himself powerless to do anything but wait. Back in Ravenshollow, strange occurrences began to plague those who had once been drawn to Dorian's beauty and charm. Whispers spread through the town like wildfire, stories of nightmares, inexplicable illness, and a growing sense of doom that clung to anyone who had set foot in Black Manor. It started small. The housemaids whispered of strange sounds emanating from the gallery at night, soft murmurs like voices coming from behind the walls. They spoke of how the temperature dropped to a biting chill near the portrait, how the candles sputtered and died as if smothered by an unseen hand. Mrs. Hardwick, the elderly housekeeper, had been the first to fall ill. She had worked at Black Manor for over 2 decades, and never once complained of poor health. But after dusting the gallery one night, she was struck by a sudden fever, babbling incoherently about eyes that never close and a smile that consumes. Her ravings lasted days before she lapsed into silence, her frail body withering as though drained of life. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone suspected the portrait was to blame. Nathaniel was not spared from the torment. In his small studio, miles from the manor, he found his thoughts increasingly drawn to the cursed painting. He would dream of it, Dorian's youthful face, staring back at him with that same knowing smile, eyes burning with malevolence. Every time he awoke, drenched in sweat, the feeling of being watched followed him, a shadow he could never escape. The town was buzzing with rumors. The once elegant gatherings at Black Manor had dwindled to nothing, as even the most devoted of Dorian's friends began to feel the weight of his curse. Several of them reported strange visions after visiting him, their own reflections twisting in mirrors, voices whispering their deepest fears. But it was Lady Margaret's fate that solidified the growing terror. Margaret had been among Dorian's admirers, a woman of status who had often praised his beauty in hushed tones, envying his unchanging appearance. She visited the manor late one evening, determined to discover Dorian's secret for herself. What happened inside the walls of Black Manor that night remained unclear, but Margaret was found the next morning wandering the streets in her nightgown, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. She spoke of seeing something unspeakable in the gallery, of hearing whispers that promised eternity, but at a terrible cost. Her hair had gone white overnight, and she refused to utter Dorian's name again. Nathaniel's guilt grew with every passing day, but even more a fear clawed at his mind. He had seen what the portrait was becoming, grotesque, decayed in spirit if not in flesh. He knew the terrible truth. It was not merely a reflection of Dorian's beauty, but a vessel for something far darker. Every sin, every act of cruelty and selfishness was etched into that canvas, distorting the soul trapped within. The night after Lady Margaret's breakdown, Nathaniel received an unexpected visitor. It was Henry Hawke, a local bookseller, and a man known for his vast knowledge of folklore and the occult. His face was ashen when he arrived, his eyes wide with the same fear Nathaniel had come to know all too well. "You must come with me," Henry whispered, his voice shaking. "I've discovered something. Something about the portrait." Nathaniel's heart raced. He hadn't told anyone of the curse, yet here was Henry, as terrified as he had been on the night he finished the painting. Without waiting for an answer, Henry pulled a worn leather book from his satchel and opened it to a page filled with ancient, cryptic symbols. "This is no ordinary painting," Henry said, his voice a tremor of panic. "It's connected to an ancient spell, one that binds a man's soul to an object. It's as old as time itself. I think Dorian has found a way to cheat death." Nathaniel stared at the book, his breath catching in his throat. He knew in his bones that Henry was right, but the implications were far worse than he had imagined. "The portrait. It's alive, isn't it?" Henry nodded grimly. "It is. And it's not just preserving his youth. It's feeding on the lives of others. Every misfortune, every death. It all goes back to that cursed painting. It's growing more powerful, Nathaniel. If we don't destroy it, more will suffer." Nathaniel felt the weight of Henry's words press down on him. The whispers in the gallery, the nightmares, the growing sickness. He had done this. He had unleashed something terrible, something that might never be contained. But how could they destroy something bound by ancient magic? How could they sever the connection between the portrait and the man who would never age? The answer lay deep within Black Manor, and Nathaniel knew there was only one way to stop it. They would have to face the darkness inside the portrait and confront the monster Dorian had become. The wind howled as Nathaniel and Henry approached Black Manor under a moonless sky. Raven's Hollow was unnaturally silent, the usual bustle of the town absent, as if the entire place was holding its breath. Every step closer to the manor felt heavier, as though an invisible force tried to pull them back. But Nathaniel knew there was no turning back now. The portrait had to be destroyed before more lives were claimed by its curse. The doors of the manor creaked open, the cold air inside seeping into Nathaniel's bones. The butler, looking paler and weaker than before, led them through the familiar dark corridors. The faint scent of decay seemed to cling to the walls, as if the house itself was rotting from within. Henry's face was grim, his eyes darting nervously as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. When they reached the gallery, Nathaniel hesitated, dread coiling in his gut. The door to the gallery stood before them, looming like a gateway to something far worse than either man could imagine. It had been weeks since Nathaniel had last seen the portrait, and the memory of those cruel, gleaming eyes still haunted his dreams. "Are you ready?" Henry whispered, clutching the book of ancient spells to his chest. Nathaniel nodded, though his hands trembled. He reached for the doorknob and pushed it open, the hinges screeching like a dying creature. The room beyond was colder than the rest of the manor, the air thick with a malevolent presence. The candles flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows across the floor. And there, in the center of the room, hung the portrait of Dorian Black. Nathaniel's breath hitched. The once beautiful image had changed again, the decay far worse than before. Dorian's face remained youthful, but something was terribly wrong. His skin, though smooth, had taken on a sickly pallor, like that of a corpse. The flawless features were now hollowed, gaunt, and the once subtle smirk had twisted into a sneer of pure malice. But it was the eyes that sent a wave of nausea through Nathaniel. They were black, like twin voids, as though they no longer reflected light but absorbed it, pulling in all the darkness of the world. "The portrait," Henry muttered, his voice trembling with disbelief. "It's feeding off him." Nathaniel stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. As he stared at the grotesque reflection of Dorian in the portrait, he realized the truth. This was not just an image of Dorian's physical self. It was a window into his soul, and that soul was rotting. "I've seen enough," Nathaniel whispered, pulling away from the cursed image. "We have to destroy it." Before they could move, a voice echoed from the shadows. "You won't touch it." Dorian Black stepped from the darkness, his form as perfect as ever, untouched by the decay that consumed his portrait. His appearance was as radiant as it had been the night Nathaniel first painted him, impossibly beautiful, a picture of youth and health. Yet the coldness in his eyes revealed the monster within. "You've come to destroy my work?" Dorian asked, his voice dripping with venom. "Do you think I'll allow that?" Nathaniel's mouth went dry. "It's not just your work, Dorian. It's your curse." Dorian chuckled, a dark and hollow sound. "Curse? No, Nathaniel. This is a gift. I've been freed from time, from death. You gave me this. Look at what it's doing to you," Nathaniel shouted, pointing at the portrait. "You may look the same, but your soul, it's decaying. Every time someone dies, it grows worse." Dorian's smile faded, and a cold fury flashed across his face. "And what do I care for my soul? You think I want to grow old? To wither like the rest of you?" Henry, clutching the spellbook, stepped forward. "This isn't immortality, Dorian. It's corruption. The longer you keep that portrait, the more you'll lose, until there's nothing left of you. For a moment, something flickered in Dorian's eyes, something almost human, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He laughed bitterly and took a step toward them, his presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. "You think you can stop me?" Dorian asked, his voice low and threatening. "I've already cheated death. I am eternal. You can't destroy what I've become." Nathaniel's hands shook, but he forced himself to step toward the portrait. "I have to try." Before Dorian could react, Henry began chanting the incantation from the book, his voice trembling but resolute. The candles flickered violently, and the air grew colder, as if the very walls of the manor were closing in around them. Dorian's eyes widened, rage contorting his perfect features. "No!" he screamed, lunging toward Henry, but Nathaniel was faster. Grabbing the fireplace poker, he swung it with all his strength, shattering the glass that protected the portrait. A howling wind erupted from the painting, as if the very soul of the house had been awakened. Dorian staggered, clutching his chest as if he felt the blow in his own body. The portrait's surface began to crack, the once vibrant colors darkening, twisting into something unrecognizable. Dorian let out a strangled cry, his youthful face contorting in pain as the portrait, the source of his immortality, began to crumble. With one final desperate scream, Dorian collapsed to the ground. His perfect face, once untouched by time, now reflected the decay that had been hidden for so long. The portrait, his soul, was finally broken. Dorian lay motionless on the cold stone floor, his body a crumpled reflection of the grotesque image in the portrait. The once beautiful man had withered in an instant, his skin sagging and gray, veins dark and protruding as though years had ravaged him in mere moments. Nathaniel stood frozen, the broken fireplace poker still clutched in his trembling hand, his mind struggling to comprehend the transformation. It was over, but the room still buzzed with an unsettling energy, as if the curse lingered, refusing to die. The portrait, though cracked and broken, continued to hum with a faint, malevolent life. The eyes in the painting, now black pits of emptiness, seemed to stare back at Nathaniel, daring him to look away. A final reminder of the horror he had unleashed. Henry, panting and pale from the effort of reciting the spell, stepped forward cautiously. Is it done?" His voice was barely a whisper, filled with hope, but tinged with fear. Nathaniel wanted to believe it was. He wanted to believe that by shattering the portrait, they had severed Dorian's unnatural connection to it, that the curse had finally been broken. But something in the air told him otherwise. "I don't know," Nathaniel murmured, his eyes never leaving the portrait. I thought destroying it would end everything. But..." A low groan echoed through the room, and both men turned their gaze back to Dorian. His body, though twisted and aged beyond recognition, was beginning to move. His fingers, bony and gnarled, twitched against the floor. Slowly, agonizingly, Dorian raised his head. Nathaniel gasped in horror. Dorian's face, what was left of it, was a mask of decay, his once lustrous hair now thin and brittle, patches of skin hanging loosely from his skull. But his eyes were still filled with that same dark hunger, burning with an otherworldly fire. He was alive, if this mockery of life could even be called that. "You think you've won?" Dorian rasped, his voice guttural, barely human. "You've only delayed the inevitable." Nathaniel staggered back, horror spreading through his veins. How are you still?" Dorian let out a grotesque laugh, more a gurgle of wrath than a sound of triumph. "The portrait, it's only a vessel. The curse, It's deeper. It lives in me now. You cannot kill what's already transcended death. Henry stepped forward, his voice shaking. The spell. It was supposed to break the connection. Dorian's decayed lips twisted into a sneer. You think a few ancient words can undo what has been bound by centuries of darkness? Fool. I am eternal. The painting is only a piece of it. Nathaniel's heart sank. He had failed. Everything he had done, every desperate act to destroy the portrait, had only wounded Dorian, not ended him. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on them, the air thick with malevolence. Dorian's immortality had not been severed, merely weakened. The true source of his power still lurked in the shadows, beyond the grasp of any spell. But then, as Nathaniel looked at the portrait, cracked, crumbling, but still faintly pulsing, he realized something. The connection was not completely broken, but it was damaged. The portrait might still be the key. Henry, Nathaniel whispered, his voice barely audible. The painting. It's not done. We need to destroy it completely. Henry looked at him in confusion. We already broke it. No, Nathaniel interrupted, his eyes fixed on the remnants of the cursed canvas. We need to burn it. Destroy it completely. Only then will the curse end. Before Henry could respond, Dorian let out a guttural snarl and lunged toward Nathaniel with what little strength remained in his deteriorating body. His hands, like claws, reached out for Nathaniel's throat. But Nathaniel was faster this time, adrenaline coursing through him as he grabbed the broken pieces of the fireplace poker and drove them through the painting's heart. The room erupted in chaos. The portrait howled, an unearthly scream, as if the very fabric of the cursed magic was being torn apart. Flames, bright and unnatural, burst from the canvas, licking at the edges of the frame, consuming it from within. The black eyes in the painting flared, then dimmed, their malevolent glow extinguished as the fire consumed the last of its soul. Dorian let out a scream, not of rage but of agony. His body convulsed violently, his skin splitting and peeling away in great, rotting sheets. The curse, bound to the painting, now turned inward, devouring him from the inside. His once youthful face, now grotesque, melted into nothingness as his body collapsed to the floor, nothing more than ash and bone. The flames roared higher, engulfing the portrait completely, until all that was left was a pile of smoldering embers. Silence fell over the room, thick and oppressive, as the last echoes of the curse died away. Nathaniel and Henry stood in stunned silence, watching the ashes cool.